Well, hey, thanks so much for watching. We would love for you to like our YouTube page, harvest.247, and also go to Facebook and Instagram, harvest.247 there as well. You can also go to harvest247.online. If you would love to partner with us financially, you can give there as well. We would be honored for that. And we are so thankful Harvest exists so that all people may know Jesus and grow with Him. And we are in a second sermon of a series called Under Pressure. And basically, here's the point. We all live under pressure at different times in our life, and many of us feel like we're living under pressure in today's time, just a lot of societal pressures. And so we can always glean from what it's like to follow Jesus by looking at people who follow Jesus in times of immense pressure. Last week we looked at Moses, and this week we're going to look at one of my favorite characters in all of Scripture, Queen Esther. And so shout out to our ladies. Really, really excited about this. You know, a lot of times it's really difficult to live under pressure. And so there was this one time that we went up to hike Mount Evans when I lived in Colorado. It's a 14,000 foot mountain. And in order to hike Mount Evans from where we were hiking from, you have to go off trail. So there's no trail whatsoever. So we are hiking off trail, moving back between all these willows and the bush and kind of jumping over these little creeks and all that, and then scaling the side of one hill. Just grass. There's no path. You just walk straight up or try to zigzag a little bit to make it less intense. And finally, we get to what they call the saddle. And it's the saddle between two 14ers. One of them is Mount Bierstadt. One of them is Mount Evans. And we begin to walk around to join the trail to Mount Evans. Now, Mount Evans, it was not supposed to be a really intense, dangerous hike. And it really turned out not to be. However, as we skirted around the side of Mount Evans to walk on the trail to get to its summit, I quickly realized that for the next hour and a half, we were basically going to be walking across a 14,000 foot mountain at about 13,900 feet. And at the bottom was Lake Abyss. And there was just a very gentle and sometimes not quite gentle drop off. And that if we lost footing or fell, we would be hurting really, really bad. And so it's one of those situations where you find yourself in and you're thinking, why am I doing this? And what is the purpose in doing this? And is it really worth the risk to continue doing this? And I bet you found yourself in those scenarios as well. I bet you found yourself in those scenarios in many different avenues of your life where you're sitting there thinking, is this really worth the risk? I mean, we're starting a business and it's going to take that much capital up front to do this. Is this really worth the risk? Because I'm really comfortable with what we've got in the bank right now. Or maybe, you know, is this really worth the risk? Because I'm going to give up some extra time to do something, to coach something, to be a part of something. But I really like my lifestyle where I can go home and kind of sit in front of the TV and all that. Is this really worth the risk? I'm having this surgery and the doctors are pretty sure it's going to work, but not super sure that it's going to work. And so is this really worth the risk? Is this really worth the risk? It's changing jobs. I've been at this one for a long time. I know I've got security, but I've got a lot more opportunity over here. Is it worth the risk? Well, Queen Esther finds herself in the exact same place when we find her in this story. And one of the things that Esther does is kind of like last week when we talked about burning the ships. I mean, she is like a ship burner, okay? And so as we get to the end of this story, she's going to give us a little bit of wisdom and knowledge on when we feel under pressure and we're asking the question, is this really worth the risk? How do we live under pressure? She's going to give us a very simple answer that some of us are going to like, some of us are going to feel it's freeing, and some of us are going to be just really afraid of it. So here we go. Queen Esther was someone who risked her life. She approached the king uninvited. And what we know during this time is that that was not permissible. The king, it's a very patriarchal society. The king had to summon you. If you were going to talk to the king, meet with the king, he was going to summon you. In Esther 1, we seen that Queen Vashti did not go to the king when summoned, and she was banished. So if you want to read that story, Esther 1, 10 through 12, she was summoned by the king, she didn't go, and she was banished. And so not only does that part tell us that you have to be summoned by the king, but if you don't do what the king says, you can be banished, you can be killed, and that is an absolute consequence. When we get to Esther 4, Mordecai, Esther's uncle, encourages Esther to take a risk and ask for freedom from the Jewish people in the exile in Persia. And so that's where we're going to find our story. And it was a great risk, and it was worth for the greater good. But here's the thing. As we saw with Queen Vashti, Esther could absolutely be killed. It is a very real possibility that if she goes to the king unsummoned and asks for something that is very unlikely to happen, that she could have the same fate as Queen Vashti, that she could be banished, she could be killed. And so I just wanted to set that up because this is kind of like scaling the side of a mountain where there's really only one path, and if you slip and fall, you are going to fall to your demise and be at the bottom of Lake Abyss, in the abyss, if you know what I'm saying. So as we pick up the story, it's Esther 4, verse 11, and this is what happens. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law: to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king's these 30 days. So Mordecai has made this request for Esther, and Esther is responding to him and saying to him, listen, here's the very harsh reality. If I go before the king without being summoned, I could be dead. And the king has not requested for me to come for 30 days. So Esther knows the consequences of acting. She is now under pressure. Her family is begging her to act on one side, and yet on the other side, if she acts, she may face severe consequences. So two sides are pressing in, and Esther is in the middle. So I want to give you this kind of illustration, and you'll see it up here on the screen. We just recently went through a hurricane, and as I was looking at weather patterns and all of this, I found it quite fascinating. What happened is we had a weather pattern moving from the south while also having a upper pressure or front moving from the north. And what was going to happen is that those pressures were going to cause almost like a funnel, almost like this little tube that would force the winds through it. And that was part of the reason why we had such strong winds, or the possibility for such strong winds. So when you have pressure from one side and pressure from the other, it just channels the winds through it. And in the middle of that is where you have the most resistance, the most opportunity for damage, and all of that type of thing. And so that was a very interesting revelation that you see, and you can actually see it up here on the screen. As I'm talking, you can see that illustration. Well, that illustration illustrates what's happening with Esther. She's got pressure from her family to act, but she's also feeling the pressure of the consequences of acting, and she's standing in the middle of this kind of tube, and that's where the most wind and the most damage could happen. And it's not going to happen to her family, and it's not going to happen over here. It's going to happen to Esther. So she is in the danger zone, standing in the middle of these two fronts and feeling all of the pressure from both of them. And so that kind of illustrates what Esther is experiencing. So what should Esther do when living under pressure? How should she respond? Family wants her to act. She's got pressure over here. What does she do? Esther 4, 12 through 17. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said, and then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther. Do not think of yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all over the Jews. So he's saying, listen, no matter if you're in the king's palace or if you're not in the king's palace, something is about to happen to the Jewish people, and you're going to suffer the same consequences as they are. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house, you are going to perish anyway. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So Mordecai writes something for such a time as this that talks about purpose. It talks about when we stand in the midst of pressure, that you are made for such a time as this. That the pressure that you're feeling, the circumstances you're going through, you were put there for such a time as this. And it's a reorienting of our thought process when we're feeling under pressure or living under pressure. Because a lot of times we'll ask the question, why me? Why does this have to happen to me? Why do we have to go through this? I wish I could get out of it. But what Mordecai is doing is he's reframing it for Esther and saying, yeah, I know that you might be facing this consequence, but you're going to face that consequence anyway. You're going to die anyway. But maybe, just maybe, that you, Esther, were made for such a time as this. And that this is actually the purpose for which your life is going to ultimately serve. And if you were to think about circumstances you're facing or living under pressure like that, it changes the whole question. It changes the whole perspective that you can have. Verse 15, then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai. So Mordecai frames this differently for Esther. And here's how she responds. Verse 15, then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai. Go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against everything, as Esther had ordered them. And Esther says this thing. She says, if I perish, I perish. If I die, I die. That's it. So Esther sees the implications of her actions. Therefore, she seeks a time of preparation for her encounter, and she seeks the input of others, asking them to pray and fast with her. And then she understands the consequences of her inaction. I don't want you to miss this. The consequences of her inaction are far severer than the consequences of her action. Because inaction affects the entire nation. Action affects her. And what you see is this, is that Esther all of a sudden understands the purpose in her life. It is not to live it for herself, but it is to live it for the good of other people. And if she doesn't act, a lot more people are going to suffer those consequences than if she acts. And could you imagine if we had that perspective? If we understood that if we didn't do something, if we didn't act, that there's a far greater consequence for a lot of other people besides just us. But if we act and it fails, if we act and we don't do something well, if we act and we just, it just doesn't go well, then really the consequences mainly are for us. And to live our life for other people with the view of other people, not just ourselves, to where we say, I will be willing to sacrifice myself for the good of others instead of just living for myself. There's somebody else in history that did that too, and his name was Jesus. When Jesus had to go to the cross, he didn't want to go to the cross. He asked God for the cup to pass. He's like, get me out of this thing, please. But then he said, my will, your will be done, not my will. And Jesus' inaction in that moment would have been a greater consequence for far more people than the consequence for him. And in that moment, he said, I'm going to go to the cross for you. I'm going to go to the cross for me because I love you and because I love all of these people. And I want them to have an opportunity to have a relationship with me if they just believe in me. And Esther, in the middle of this pressure, where the winds are most severe and she's feeling it, she all of a sudden says, wait a second, if I don't do this, I might be okay. Ultimately, she won't be. But if I don't do this, my inaction, it's going to affect a lot more people than just me. And so what we find is that Esther found her purpose, therefore she could live boldly under pressure. And it's a lesson for us is that finding our purpose allows us to live boldly under pressure. When we understand that we are created for such a time as this, we can feel pressure and we can live boldly from it. What Esther ultimately says is this. She says, risk it. If I die, I die. If I get killed, I get killed. But risk it. When you're under pressure and thinking, is it worth the risk? Risk it. Because finding our purpose allows us to live boldly under pressure. When you're wondering, what's the consequences going to be? Should I move in this direction? Should I trust God in this? Esther's going to say, risk it. Do it. Risk it, because your inaction has far greater consequences than your action. Risk it. And so for our online audience and our Harvest Home people, I want to give you 3 thoughts. Kind of life principles. First is risk is the price we pay for opportunity. Risk is the price we pay for opportunity. Esther's risk created an opportunity for her people. When we take a risk, often it opens up opportunities that we've never dreamed of. Seriously. When we take a risk, everybody that's ever taken a risk, it's opened up opportunities. Esther would say, risk it. Because when you find your purpose, it allows you to live boldly under pressure. Risk it. Do it. When you realize God is in control, it's easier to step forward. When you realize that ultimately you control very little of your life and that ultimately God is in control of it, whether you succeed or whether you fail, no matter what happens. When you realize that God is in control and you know that He's good and you know that He's faithful, it becomes a lot easier to take a step. What's the step that you need to take? What's the step you need to take? What is the place that you need to trust? All right, God is in control and I'm going to take the step. And if I die, I die. I'm going to be like Esther. If I perish, I perish. If I'm out, I'm out. But you know what? I'm going to risk it. I'm going to trust God and I'm going to take a step forward. What is that place? Job opportunity, relationship, what is it? And the third thing that we see that Esther does is this: take time to seek the Lord and seek counsel on big decisions. You know, I'm so amazed at the difference between how people in Scripture respond versus how we respond today. We live in a world that wants quick. They want a response now. They text you, we want a response now. Mordecai is pleading with Esther, and here's what she says. She says, before I do anything, I'm going to go. It's cool. I'm going to go. But here's the thing. Before I do, I'm going to pray and I'm going to fast. And I want you to get the elders to pray and fast. And I'm going to get my young maidservants to come and pray and fast. And we're going to talk to God about this. And I'm sure we're going to have conversations with one another about this. And it's such a great principle that when you're faced with a big decision, you don't have to make a decision until you have to. And you can go to other people that you trust and know that they follow Jesus and love you and say, hey, I'm going to take some time out and I'm going to go ask them and weigh this with them and get their feedback and get their input. And not only that, but I'm going to take time out to stop and pray and fast and do all of those types of things to seek God. I mean, if you've never fasted and prayed before, at the beginning of 2023, we're going to do that as a church. So we're going to preach about that and talk about that and do that and practice that. And so when you look at the life of Esther, she would just say, listen, when you find your purpose, it allows you to live boldly under pressure. You might feel the pressure. You might feel the wind. You might feel the weight of the consequences. But here's the thing. Esther says, look, if I die, I die. Like, okay, if I don't act, there's far greater consequences. And I believe if she was looking at you and talking to me, she would say, guys, risk it. Because risk is the price you pay for opportunity. When you realize God is in control, it's easier to step forward. And before you take that step, it's okay to step back, pause, seek the Lord, and seek wise counsel. Guys, risk it. Who cares? I'm going to close like this. My wife has been talking about doing a new venture, and it's quite the risk, but it's something that she's always wanted to do. And she may have the opportunity to do that. And she asked me, she said, what do you think? What do you think? And I said, do it. She's like, but it's a big risk. I said, risk it. It was right around that I was writing this sermon. Risk it. She's like, but what if we fail? And I'm like, but what if you never get to do the thing that you've always wanted to do? What if you go to your deathbed dying and saying, I wonder if I could have done that? Because I'm like, for me, that's a far greater consequence than never knowing. One of the things that going through what we have just gone through over this year has done, I was processing this with someone the other day, is it's just made me less fearful. Because my greatest fear, I had to face it. And I had to deal with it. And if I can say what's one of the outcomes, there's probably a lot of outcomes, but one of the outcomes is I'm just not afraid of it. And I told her, I said, okay, risk it. If we lose everything, we lose everything. If we die, we die. But don't live a life afraid to take a step when you know that God's in control. And when you read a story like Esther that says, you know what, this is why I'm created. I'm created for such a time as this. What were you created to do in this time? Because here's the thing I know. You were not created, and I was not created, to live in our house, to play it safe, to hunker down, to be worried about everything. We were created for such a time as this, to go and share the love of God, to risk our life for God, and to follow Him. And could you imagine if the world saw a church like that? That just said, if I die, I die, but I'm going to risk it. I'm going to follow Jesus. Because He's the end goal. He's the reward. If the church showed people that Jesus was the reward, not the success or not this or not that, could you imagine how that would change people's perspective of Jesus and of the church? I want us to be a church that risks it. I want us to be a church that when we're faced with difficult circumstances, yeah, we seek counsel. Yes, we pray. But you know what? Oftentimes the right decision is the step of faith, because without faith it's impossible to please God. So my encouragement to you is this. What's the thing that God's calling you to that you're like, I don't know if I can do that, but you got to do like Esther did and say, just risk it. If I die, I die. If I die, I die. I know, that seems kind of cavalier, but seriously, risk it. Because when we find our purpose, it allows us to step forward in our future. God bless you.